Good morning.
Hello. Good morning, Dr. Valin. How are
Hi.
you?
Good. How are you?
Very well.
Hi. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you both.
Nice to meet you, Dr. Valin. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're very excited to have you. We are going to talk about the work that you do as well, and the main topic of the episode is providing diversity and equity in yoga. Just to kind of start, for those who are listening and obviously who are gonna watch this, the main topic is, how we as yoga teachers, we can provide a space where we cultivate diversity, equity, where we work through inclusion and social justice through yoga and a conscious and anti-oppressive teaching. Before we kind of divert in all of these questions, Dr. Valin, I would love to hear about you. I would love to, tell us all about you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so glad to be here with the both of you, Maria and Alicia. So my background started as a third grade special ed teacher back home in New York City. And I always had this love of educating, right? I had this love of wanting to make sure that students, particularly in the K-12 environment, felt really supported. But as I was teaching, about 3 or 4 years into my teaching, I realized that there needed to be a little bit of transition that happened between how teachers understood their own identity and how that impacted the curriculum that they were designing, how that impacted their lesson development, how that impacted the ways in which they were interacting and engaging with the students and engaging with the community and engaging with their families. And so I left the classroom and decided to go pursue my doctorate in curriculum and instruction. And my work when I was in my doc program was focused in on culturally relevant pedagogy. So again, focusing in on how do we support academic success, again, in this K-12 environment, how do we support academic success with the purpose of making sure that teachers understand how their backgrounds as race, class, gendered people with sexuality and all these other pieces that form who you are, right? These social constructs of who you are, the ways in which they intersect, inform the ways in which they're teaching in the class. Mm-hmm. And so my background started as an educator, right? And once I finished my doc work, and I was exploring some various avenues, and I was an assistant professor for a little bit. It was during my time as an assistant professor that I realized that there was more of a shift there. So even in the wanting teachers and pre-service teachers in particular to understand their social constructs and their social identity development, there was also this really interesting thing that was starting to come up for me with yoga, where I was recognizing that my practice of little y yoga, not big Y yoga, but my practice of little y yoga was starting to inform the ways in which I thought about how traumas and experiences around race, around gender, around sexuality, around religion were all living in my body. And so sometimes I would get on my mat and I'd find myself practicing in a way in which I was trying to, quote unquote, liberate or break free of something that had occurred as it related to those social identity constructs.
Wow.
And so then I was like, okay, there's something here around how do we think about how race and social justice and anti-oppressive education is attached to and connected to big Y yoga, right? So more than just what do I do on my mat, but the ways in which I'm actually living in my environment, the ways in which I'm interacting in my community, the way I am building these collaboratives and these collectives with different individuals as a way of trying to connect with them, and then also recognize the power and need for vulnerability. So when I think about and I talk about big Y yoga and anti-oppressive education, it's related to this notion of we have to get very, very close and intentional with ourselves before we can even begin to think about what does social change and social action actually look like. Mm-hmm. And so I know you were asking me to tell you about myself, but I went on this tangent and started talking about some of the work that I do, but I'll pause there and And so I guess maybe the next part to know about me, right, is that I find myself sometimes telling these stories and telling them big and wide, and then I start answering all of the questions you might already have planned.
Don't worry. I think we all do that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm more than happy to to listen a little bit more. But I also wanted to ask you just something that I think I didn't ask at the beginning. But like, how do you kind of connected, your educational background with, in this case, being a yoga teacher? So yeah, go ahead. I would love to hear more.
Yeah. So, so my scholarship and research uses what's called Carrere, and Carrere is an autobiographical and psychoanalytic inquiry method. Essentially, it's essentially turning the gaze inward. And noticing yourself very deeply in terms of your own educational attainment and the ways in which you have moved through schooling. Now, Carrere can also be used, or this autobiographical method can also be used more broad scale when we're thinking about how are we understanding our race selves, or our race lived experiences, our lived experiences around sexuality, our lived experiences around religion or around socioeconomic status, and how all of those things inform our day-to-day living, how they inform the ways in which we are participating in our social world, how we find ourselves in our professional environments, with our families, with our friends, so on and so forth. So all of my work started with self-inquiry, right? Because I'm a huge believer in the fact that nothing changes outside of yourself until there is change within yourself. And so if we're looking for there to be some actual concerted effort that takes place within our school environments, within our yoga studios, that take place within our professional spaces, our family, our friends, right? It's the work that we do internally that actually brings about those changes. So you'll oftentimes hear people talk about how a system needs to change, or the system needs to be dismantled, or we have to find disruption within the system. And there is a lack of talking about how people hold up a system, right? The system didn't build itself. The system is not sustaining itself. The system's not maintaining itself. People are maintaining those things, right? And people built the system. And so unless we are doing this work that is very intentional about you, right? So very intentional about Valin, very intentional about Maria, very intentional about Alicia. Like, what does that look like when we start to do that more cooperatively and collectively for the purposes of disrupting and dismantling a system? And then what does that mean for our yoga? Our yoga studios, are our westernized ways in which we think about yoga, because that's also very complicated, but requires that this self-inquiry work pushes people to not only recognize the ways in which constructs of whiteness or white supremacy inform that, but how we're all steeped in it, right? So you can think of yourself as like a tea bag being steeped in this hot water over and over and over again, even if you identify as a person of color, right? Like you're always being steeped into this hot water of constructs of whiteness and white supremacy that require you to think about how it's seeping into your own system, right? How it's living in your body, how you then in turn practice it. And then how do you begin to unearth it and unlearn it so that you can change up the ways in which, particularly in the yoga space, right, within the yoga industry, how do you change those things so you're not constantly reproducing it?
And I think this is obviously a very important topic that needs to be discussed, needs to be raised. And my next question will be, from your experience, what's our role as yoga teachers in social justice movements? What else we can do?
Yeah. So when I hear people ask this question, it oftentimes makes me cringe. And here's why. Because what undergirds that question is the idea that the only thing that can happen is action, and it has to be external action, right? Like I have to change up what happens in my studio. I have to hire differently. I have to change my mission statement. I have to do all of these things that are external of myself. And again, nothing changes if the person doesn't actually change. So you can do all the work you want. And we saw this in 2020, right? When lots of companies were making these claims to wanting to change up their branding, change up their messaging. So they were changing this external feature, right? This facade that people were going to be able to see. But then at the same time, the folks who were making those decisions weren't actually making any internal changes, right? Changing their house, changing what was happening within them. And so you can do the work, right? So when you ask this question about like, so what can yoga teachers do? My first response, and it's the response no one wants to hear. I want you to be vulnerable with yourself. I want you to lean into the emotional exposure. I want you to lean into the riskiness of paying attention to you. And I want you to lean into the fact that it is going to be uncertain and uncomfortable. So there are a lot of messages that come through within the yoga space, right? And those messages that suggest, the only way out is through. Or if you want to see change, you have to be uncomfortable and lean into the discomfort. But very often as humans, right? And it's just our human nature. We don't want to be uncomfortable. We're going to do everything we can to try to find a way to be comfortable rather than experience the discomfort. But there is nothing comfortable about the experiences of racism. There is nothing comfortable about the experiences of sexism. There is nothing comfortable about the experiences of classism, right? And so it requires that we actually lean into being incredibly uncomfortable. So for any yoga instructor listening, or people who own yoga studios who are listening, my sage advice is to, instead of trying to change all of the things that are external, start with you, right? Like there's nothing you can do to actually be authentic in your environments until you start to do the thing that is important to you. And that's focusing in on yourself. And it sounds selfish sometimes, but it's not selfish, right? It's like when you set boundaries for yourself, right? The kindest thing you can do for others is to set your own boundaries. And it's the same thing with this, right? The kindest thing and the most activist oriented thing you can do is to pay attention to how these social identity constructs are living within your bodily and spiritual and mental system on a day-to-day basis, and begin to free yourself of those things so that you might be able to actually free others from it.
And I guess it all comes back to what you were saying at the beginning, that it all comes from internal inquiry, correct?
That's right. That's right. So it's all about the self-inquiry. And so self-inquiry is one of those things where it's like, so you practice it in meditation, right? Like you do these mindfulness activities. You can be very involved in your contemplative work, but then at the same time, find yourself not actually wanting to engage in what makes, you find yourself not wanting to engage in what actually brings about that fruitful, personal, authentic change, right? And so self-inquiry is where all of those things start. So I like to ask, so I deliver workshops through Yoga for Social Justice, right? And I have this series of workshops. And I'll say again, like my research started with like self-inquiry of teachers, K-12 teachers, people who were in elementary, middle school, and high schools. And that has blossomed out into how Yoga for Social Justice has grown. And so I deliver these workshops in yoga studios. I deliver them to nonprofit organizations, corporate spaces. And I tell people, you want to see something different with like your board? You want to see something different with like what happens in terms of how you even choose to diversify your hiring? Turn your gaze inward, right? I want to see you actually practice self-inquiry. And you can actually see how people's demeanors completely shift when they're asked to pay attention to themselves. And so I always pose this question, like, so what do you need to disrupt within yourself? You want to disrupt the system. You want to disrupt your hiring practices. You want to disrupt the fact that when people come into your yoga classes, all they're seeing are white bodies. Like, so then what do you need to disrupt within yourself? And very often people have a hard time answering that question. right? Because just asking that question requires that you go so deep to your core to recognize that there is something in you that actually requires disruption. And not until that question is posed do most people even consider that they have something to disrupt within themselves, right? It's one thing to ask someone, what do you need to let go of, right? So we do a lot of practicing of letting go in our yoga communities, right? But it's very different to ask someone, what do you actually need to disrupt? And to disrupt what means that you are severing something, right? Like you're creating a rupture in something so that there can actually be something that grows out of it that is different from your current reality. So that's self-inquiry, right? That for me, that's self-inquiry.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I would love to also understand a little bit more, what do you think other questions we should inquire? What other questions internally we should raise?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So asking yourself, like, what do I need to disrupt within me? Asking yourself, where in my community environments am I practicing avoidance? And how is that avoidance showing up in my day-to-day life? Asking yourself the question about what do I need for my own healing? And then getting very clear about what you're trying to heal from. So oftentimes folks will suggest that they don't have anything related to race or sexism or classism that they actually have to heal from, right? Because what they'll look at is the fact that they experienced, that they didn't experience any blatant acts or explicit acts of people treating them poorly, and not recognizing the ways in which racism, sexism, classism, all of the isms, right, function in a way in which it is so implicit that you can ignore it. So I'll give you an example of this. So as someone who identifies as able-bodied, meaning I can walk in or out of spaces with ease, right? I don't necessarily require accommodations like having captions on during a Zoom meeting or something like that, right? So I can easily function in a world where I don't even have to think about what the accessibility requirements are. Because as an able-bodied person, I am privileged in that way. That's how all isms work, right? You can function within a racist society and not have to think about the ways in which society is racist because you are privileged in it, right? The structures in the system benefit you. So I can go into a public restroom and never, not once, think about the height of the sink. Right? Because the height of the sink doesn't matter to me because I'm not in a wheelchair. I'm not in a space in which I actually need the height of the sink to be different. I can walk in and out of door spaces and not consider the size of the door frame because I can move in and out of the door frame with ease, right? And so it's things like this that oftentimes folks are not thinking of. This is what requires disruption and this is what I need to heal from, right? And so when we think about healing, it's that you've become, you think about wounds, you think about trauma, you think about these experiences that have harmed you in some way, right? And so I have been harmed by an ableist society that has raised me and allowed for me to thrive in this way in which I can continue to create harm and violence for others by not considering all of the things that I just mentioned, right? So if I were an architect, I could easily use my ableist background, right? My own experience as an able-bodied person and never think about the size of a door frame, right? And I can build that structure and not think about that, which is part of the reason why, you know, we see a lot of these issues that get raised with social media, right? Or the ways in which things come up with the algorithm. So if you're familiar with what happened with Google's algorithm a few years ago, that if you typed in Black man, pictures of monkeys showed up, right? And so it was there's a person behind the algorithm who is creating this algorithm, who is allowed themselves to associate what they think about Black identity, right? And to be able to associate it in a very dehumanizing way to the point where it was showing up in Google searches. And so it's things like that, right? That people very often don't consider they need to heal from, right? Because we are all steeped in this hot water that allows for those things to continue to perpetuate and create these cycles in which folks are not thriving and living their best lives due to it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And obviously, when we talk about diversity and equity, for those who are listening, of course, we are not only talking about race and color, as you were just mentioning. So we talk about, we need to understand that there's also, cultural, historical, political, social construction of class, disability, gender, race, religion, sexuality. And, I think it's very important for, everyone, of course, but also for yoga teachers, and specifically why yoga teaches, to ensure there is inclusivity and equity, not only in yoga classes, but in our daily lives. But from the yoga lens, what tips will you have, or what do you think we should do, apart from all the internal inquiry that you mentioned, but what we can do in class to make sure that we are offering diverse and equal environment once teaching?
Yeah, so one thing I'm going to do right now is to give some definition of terms, because I think oftentimes when folks have these conversations, people crosstalk, meaning someone has one definition that they're operating from and someone else has another definition that they're operating from, and then you end up cross-talking or talking past each other because you're not talking about the exact same thing. So for instance, one of those one word or two words that oftentimes get conflated with each other are prejudice and discrimination, right? They don't mean the same thing. Prejudice is internal, right? Like I can be prejudiced about just about anything. It is human nature to be able to prejudge, which is simply what prejudice is. Discrimination, though, is when those prejudgments start to live themselves out in your external words, in your external world, right? So discrimination is the external action of the stuff that's going on in your head that is already part of your human nature to do so. And so I think one thing, right, that people can do as yoga instructors is to make sure that they are all operating from the same shared language so that they might be able to move forward in constructive and cohesive ways within their yoga studios. Another part to this is thinking about equity and equality, right? Equity is about giving people what they need. Equality is about giving everybody the exact same thing. And so within a yoga class, right, particularly when we're talking about the asana practice, so not big Y yoga of all of the other elements of what encompasses yoga, but when people walk into your studio for the purposes of the asana practice, for the physical part of it, making sure that you're actually delivering a class that meets the varying body types and needs and of every single student that is there, right? Very often you can walk into a yoga studio and walk into a yoga class and the teacher will deliver the exact same thing to everyone without actually offering any of the accommodations, right? So you can hear someone call for dancer, right? Call for dancers, folks, get there, and then not actually offer how someone might be able to do it using a strap. Mm-hmm. Or how, what the variation it could look like from start to bottom. So there are a lot of different ways in which we can think about what it means to be equitable. The other part to this is thinking about inclusion. So you mentioned diversity. So diversity is the variation of just human beings, right? Like everybody's just walking into the space as diverse beings. And so the space is always diverse. It's about whether or not the space is inclusive. And so when we're thinking about inclusion, it is not just I have my door open and you can walk in and I've made the space inclusive. So I like to give this example that if I throw a dinner party and I invite the two of you over for dinner, but one of you is gluten-free, dairy-free, and a vegan, and I offer all meals that are gluten, all foods that are full of dairy and lots of meat. That means I gave you an invitation, but you have not actually been included at my dinner party, right? Because I did not take into consideration your needs. And so when we're thinking about creating inclusive yoga spaces, that means I have to take into consideration your individual needs when you come into this space. So that then means I actually have to know the students who are walking in. So let's say you come to my class all the time, Maria, but I know that you suffer from migraines, and light can cause and create that moment for you, right? Like if you are too close to sunlight or too close to a fluorescent light, that might strike you in a very terrible way. And so then I make sure that there is space for you that is in a corner of sorts that does not get too much light, so that you are not impacted by that and don't have this experience of a migraine during class, right? So it requires that yoga instructors do more than just teach their classes, but they know the students who show up to their classes. And students on one end, right, like will always choose to go back to the instructor that they like the best, right? Both of you probably have people who come into your classes who you see regularly, right? Those same people who are there all of the time. And so making sure that you actually get close enough to understand them, building that relationship, and again, this is where the self-inquiry part comes in from, right? So you can teach a class and never, ever build a relationship with somebody. And so that would say to me that the disruption that you have to create within yourself is building relationship, right? Like, what does it mean for you to get relational? And so if you're looking for, and for teachers and instructors who are listening, right, it's more than just saying like, all are welcome here or everyone is welcome in this space, but you actually have to change up the things that you were doing. And in order for you to change up the things that you were doing, you have to recognize and call attention to the fact that you are creating an unjust environment. So if you aren't even willing to recognize that you yourself are creating the unjust and unjust environment, then nothing's going to change. And so again, coming back to accessibility, because I think it's one of those things that oftentimes gets missed, and accessibility is very much informed by our white supremacist whiteness constructs that impacts the world globally, right? So this sense of urgency, that's a sort of qualifier of white supremacy. So the sense of urgency, need for perfection, things happening in particular order and time exactly as presented, right? And so when we're thinking about accessibility and meeting the needs of people who are disabled, or even just meeting the needs of a variety of people, you want to ensure that you're actually providing all options possible so that those folks feel included, right? And again, accessibility and missing accessibility is one of those things that can easily not be thought about often. And so it is something that for able-bodied folks who are listening, right, and for yoga instructors to think about, how are you disrupting the ways in which ableism shows up in your day-to-day life, and how do you begin to challenge that on an ongoing basis? So maybe one way in which you start to challenge it is like when you're on Zoom meetings, turn on the captions. Maybe another way in which you do it, if you're presenting something, make sure you don't have a lot of colors on the screen, right? That you're using black and white colors because you're considering color blindness, right? Make sure that when you're delivering a yoga class, that you are actually asking people before the class starts, what do you need, right? It's such a simple question, but it's such a powerful question, and it empowers everybody in the space when you say, what do you need?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And I think yeah, that's a great point, because I think as a yoga teachers, we have obviously, you know, the opportunity to also provide comfort, no, when we are in class. Ali, I would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah. So first of all, I mean, I'm happy about this episode because I really think there is the need of it. And to be honest, I totally agree with what you said. And when I think about it, I would love for my future student and the actual student as well to feel their bodies and souls grow in this beautiful practice, to feel empowered in their own body as it is, whatever color or shape or ability, as we talked, with no judgment or aesthetically perfect poses at all costs, as you often see in the social media, for example. Mm-hmm. So I thought a lot before this episode, what could I do I mean, I think this was the first time I really asked myself this question in a kind of different way. I mean, and I thought about, I don't know, I could teach asanas variations at the same level of the classic considered pose, maybe, or make props something useful for everybody to find more out about their practice instead of teaching if they're only for those who can't like arrive to the floor in Uttanasana, for example, because this is something I used to do. And thinking about it, maybe it's something that I could change in my practice, or I could try also to be more supportive without telling students how they should feel in a specific pose. Because the first time I did it, like, you should feel this way, you should feel that way, because I mean, I was still trying to find my own way of teaching. But maybe it's better, as you say, to ask them about how they feel in that specific pose, or to listen to their bodies and act accordingly with my support, offering variations that are not explained as serious B positions, kind of. So I would also love to study more how we can translate the practice for people with disabilities or injuries. It's definitely a challenge, but I think it would be amazing. It's something that we don't care about enough. And also, in my opinion, it's important not to use gender-specific language, because we don't know and we can't assume things based on appearance, even if it seems easy. I mean, it happened to me that sometimes when I got a message on the screen, but it happened to me often in classes, like when we're all ladies, that the teacher says, "Oh, welcome, ladies," or something like that. I think this is something that could seem innocuous, like, you know, but in the reality, it could hurt somebody. So I think that personally, I would love to do also something to see more, I don't know, Black or Asian yoga teacher where I live, because I live in a very small town. When, I mean, people do not have this awareness. So it would be great. And sometimes I ask myself, how could I do to, I don't know, help people to change their thinking? And for sure, I'll always speak up for everyone who may feel harassed, or I would love to be an example in the yoga community. And I always apologize when making a mistake, because I mean, we're all humans, but I believe it's important for everyone to feel safe and not treated in a different way in class. And I often saw also competition, even if not told, but you could feel it. I mean, especially in the beginning. I remember my first class practicing, I was like continuously comparing myself with others, like, oh my God, she can do this. Oh, I can do this. Oh my God, I can practice yoga. And I think that as well is something that teacher could help. I mean, we could help to create a different environment where people are not looking at these doing these comparisons with others. But sometimes I really ask myself, how could I do? What can I say to help them not to feel like this? But for sure, I need to learn more and more to help the change in this yoga world, at least perceived. I mean, because I would love people in the yoga world to talk more about this, to raise awareness. I think we need people to be aware. And I search for this topic on the internet a lot, and I think there aren't enough articles or videos about it, to be honest. There are, but just it seems there are just because, like, I mean, it's 2020, 21. It's like kind of, you know, something that it's, I mean, we're all talking about this, but I don't want this to stop. I mean, I think we need to continue to talk about this and to have more videos and chats about it. I feel like today in this episode, we're doing something in this sense. I mean, I really love it. So really, thank you for this opportunity.
Absolutely. So you just said so many things, and I think one thing that
oh, sorry, I talked a lot.
No. You said a lot that I think we have to sort of unpack and expand on, and I'm going to try to catch as much of it as I can. But one of the things,
so we good.
Okay, one of the things that I think is important to consider is that the folks who are leading the yoga space, right, are not people of color, right? They are all too often in our ad campaigns, the people who own the studios, people who are who are leading these teacher trainings, right? All of those folks, more often than not, are white. And that is something that is under critiqued, but also the level to which, so last year, right, in 2020, when everyone was like, oh my gosh, everything needs to change now. And it's like, we're long overdue for something to have to change, because the second yoga was picked up by the white Western world, that was when it actually needed to start, right? And that was eons ago, years ago. But the experience of that for people has been, I'm too tired to do it. This makes me tired. I thought I've done enough. Now you want me to do more, right? And so what happens in all of that is that none of the things that you mentioned can be erased. So that sense of feeling like that competition exists, or that you have to compare yourself to someone, the time for it to be eliminated never happened, because people experience the sense of, well, I'm too tired to try to figure out how to make that happen, right? Like, I just hired my first teacher of color. So now, like, you want me to do this other thing too? Like, how am I supposed to do all of these things? I'm just one
like
person.
Ticking a box, right?
Exactly.
That's done.
Yeah. And it's more than just ticking a box, right? Like, this is more than just ticking a box. This is a lifelong project. And I think if we're actually looking for yoga studios and the people who run them, so it's not just the studio, and it's not just the industry. This goes back to what I said about the system, right? There are people who prop up a system. And so it's the people who are running those studios, who are hiring people, those same teachers who are teaching in those places, that have to consider that this is a lifelong project. So if I want this to be different, that means I have to immerse myself in the reading. I have to immerse myself in these conversations. I have to immerse myself in the mistake making and being okay with making mistakes, right? Like, you raised a really good point when you said, like, I apologize, and I do my best to do that. But there's a lot of ego that comes with people saying, I won't apologize, right? Or people not being willing to accept that they have done something wrong, or that they have created harm, or that they have created violence in some sort for another person. And so again, this goes back to what we need to disrupt, right? Like, what do I need to disrupt within myself so that I might even be able to get to a point of apologizing, right? Apologizing is so meaningful. And then even in those apologies, how do we set new boundaries for how we treat each other? And boundaries aren't problematic. Like, boundaries don't say, I'm keeping you away from me. Boundaries are saying, I am telling you how to treat me. And now that I know what that boundary is, I'm going to respect that, right? And so there are so many things that are wrapped up in how social justice work and anti-oppressive work is connected to our relationship building, our community building, our ability to be vulnerable with ourselves and with other people, and our ways in which we begin to traverse the landscape towards healing. And it is, of course, an exhausting process. I'm not going to lie and say it's not tiresome, right? And as people of color, like, yeah, it's tiring for us too. And the labor behind it, right, feels exhausting. But what I find myself sometimes asking is, like, is my exhaustion outweighing my feeling of radical love? Right? So this is more than just the platitudes of I love you that feel really nice, and there's rainbows and unicorns shitting fairy dust and whatever else might happen, right? But this is like, this radical sense of, like, I know that the world needs to change. I know I need to see transformation in others. I want to love you so hard that maybe what I say to you doesn't sound very nice. Maybe what I say to you does make you cry, and that's okay. Cry. Crying is good for you. My grandfather used to say, the more you cry, the less you pee. So it's one of those things, like, if that part of this work requires people who are interested in actual radical love, rather than just saying love will change everything, right? And it's true, love will change it, but like love requires that you are doing the things sometimes that looks like critique, it looks like analysis, it looks like stopping certain relationships, it looks like breaking things apart and breaking down, it looks painful, right? Like a love that's not creating a little bit of discomfort and a little bit of pain, and maybe sometimes a lot of pain, is not a love I want. Like, I know that sounds weird to hear someone say like they don't want to love without pain. And so when I say that, like, I don't mean I like physical pain, right? Like, I want the pain that's saying to me, like, you are in a bad way right now and you need to change. And that there are people in my life who are recognizing it, who are calling me on it, and who are pushing me to do the really hard work of making that change.
Mm-hmm.
And so, social justice work without that radical love and without that radical transformation and without radical empathy and like without those pieces, we will not see the change we actually want to see. And here's the other sort of realist part of this, right? Because in a lot of ways, people talk about wanting to see the system change, and I want to dismantle white supremacy and I want it to go away. And it's like, it's not going anywhere. Right? It's probably the most stable force in our environments. And this goes with any ism, right? In my lifetime, I am 35 years old. In my lifetime, I am not going to see any of these structures disappear. And I say that so confidently because there were people before me who also were trying to do this work up until their 80s and nothing changed, right? Like, and we still have the exact same structures we've been functioning in globally for a really long time. And so I think the other thing that folks have to grapple with is like, you can continue to do all this work and you're still going to run into roadblocks, and that's okay. It is a both and, right? You put both of your hands out and you can say like, I'm doing the work, but also I know there's going to be more bullshit that shows up, right? It is a both and. And so if you can get comfortable with that both and sit with that discomfort, but also lean into the very revelatory experience of like, you are bringing about change, particularly for the people in your lives,
Mm-hmm.
and you're doing the work, right? And that has to be more widely consumed as I am doing the work, even if I don't see the corporation next door or my government system overhauling everything, right? Again, because it's about the people. So it is a slow and steady process to get people to want to be different. And that stuff does not happen overnight.
And I think that's also a very good point that you just made about the individual work. I think every single person, each of us, we can help with that change, put in the work, as you mentioned, starting from self-inquiry, but we have to put the work. And it starts from using inclusive language, as we already talked about. It starts with, I think, yeah, I just wanted to make a point in that the individual work, it is necessary because that's what we need to kind of create together and experience that kind of community to promote change and healing together. So I think that was a very great point, Valin. When you
and I don't mean to cut you off, but it's like doing the individual work to the point of being self-centered, where it's like, well, I'm doing all of this work. Why isn't everybody else doing all of this work? My bubble is fine, right? Like, you can also meet people who think they're doing all of the work and then have insulated themselves so well to the point where they think, well, because I'm not like this and my kids aren't like this, my husband's not like this, so we are fine, right? But that's not doing the work, right? That's you creating yourself in a little insular bubble where your individual work only pertains to the people who live in your house.
Correct.
And so I also want to make sure that I'm qualifying this well enough to say that the individual work that you're up to is expansive, right? Like, it expands beyond the people that you can reach and touch at the end of the night. You are doing this work so that it is transforming your neighborhood. It is transforming your job workplace. It is transforming the places in which you practice yoga. It is transforming the park maybe that you go to run in, right? Like it is transforming all of those things. So think about yourself as an octopus. So you're doing all of these things, right? Like where you're changing your insides, and you've got these 8 tentacles that are touching all of these other environments, so that you're actually bringing change into those other spaces. And so this individual work, it's not self-centered in the I'm doing this, so I'm better, my family's better, and that's all that matters. But it's all of the other pieces that you touch within your world.
Thank you for clarifying. And it's that individual work that reflects into a role that is collective, and this is for collective engagement.
That's right.
Correct?
Yes. Yeah. So you can imagine that, like, when you do your work, Maria, and you are committed to doing the work, and you're committed to what social justice is all about, then that means you're also going to push Alicia to do the work, right? And then you're going to push your other co-hosts to also do the work. You're also going to push everybody else that you're around to do the work. So your individual work happens in collaboration with other people. So it's like, and I'm constantly doing this too. So it's also one of those things, like, as a social justice educator and someone who studies this and has been leaning into this for a really long time, like, the work doesn't stop for me, right? Like, I might be super knowledgeable about this, but I'm super knowledgeable about it today, and I'll be more knowledgeable about it tomorrow, right? Because again, coming back to able-bodied privilege, someone will point out something to me that has to do with the ways in which I've practiced ableism. And one of those things, as I'm thinking about it right now, is that I talk really fast. And so I have to be mindful of this, right? Like, I have to be conscious of the fact that I've got to slow down. And that's not anything about someone else, right? Like, every human being is bringing assets into a place. They are not bringing deficits. They are bringing assets into the place. And those assets require each of us to think about, how am I paying attention to those assets, and what can I change to make sure that their assets are fully experienced, so that they experience success in the way in which they want to experience success. And so that goes, and again, that also points us to inclusive language, right? Because when we think about accessibility, oftentimes accessibility is thought about in terms of just disability, but accessibility is about creating an environment that can be accessed by all people. And an environment can't be accessed if you're using harmful or exclusive language. So if you're using incorrect pronouns with people, either unconsciously or consciously, right? Like, you are not creating an accessible space. You're not creating an environment that all people can access. And so how do we work with yoga instructors, or just people in general, to be mindful to the language that they're using? So instead of using a pronoun, maybe you just replace it with the person's name, right? So rather than saying, Mary is wearing her red skirt today, maybe you just say Mary is wearing a red skirt, right? And that can feel, sometimes when you're trying to write this, right, it can feel awkward to keep replacing the pronoun with the person's name. But getting into a practice of doing that, or even learning how to reword content so that you are limiting the number of times you're using a person's name, is completely fine. But you also want to hold integrity to the fact that if you don't know a person's pronouns, use their name repeatedly. But you can also ask someone, hey, what pronouns would you like for me to use when I am talking about you? Right? And don't say preferred. So people will oftentimes say, what are your preferred pronouns? Don't use preferred, because preference means it can change depending on the day, right? And so rather than using preferred and devaluing someone in that way, just say, like, what pronouns would you like for me to use when I introduce you? What pronouns would you like me to use when I talk about you? What pronouns would you like for me to use when I'm talking to you? So that I am honoring and valuing how you identify. And that's really, it sounds like I'm about to trivialize this, but it's really about how do we honor people? Like, how do we honor your human nature? And it shouldn't feel that hard, but it is hard for people to recognize that what you're up to is how do I value and honor you in a way that allows for you to experience the success you wish to experience and feel in this life.
Mm-hmm. And it's your identity, as you said, how I can honor you as a person, how can I honor your identity? And I think just talking about inclusive language, for example, this is just like a very, very small piece of the work that we can do as yoga teachers. Like, for example, as you very well said, Dr. Valin, instead of saying, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, we can just say, good morning, everyone. And just trying, I think, to use the language when we are teaching, I think that's a great starting point, obviously, as you mentioned, and thank you for also educating us both on this talk, Dr. Valin. But I think it's great to be able to do small steps to get to a bigger point. And because we were just talking about language and, practical things, what we can do, I just wanted to kind of wrap up with maybe a conclusion and, what things other yoga teachers can do. We should, I think, ask for a type of commitment. I think we should checking. This is just kind of my personal opinion, but obviously I would love to hear from you, Dr. Valin, in a second. But, maybe it's important to recognize, the role that you do, and maybe we can start working with people like yourself, with equity and inclusion consultants who are helping us to do that. I know there is also free resources available, and obviously I'll list as well your website, Yoga4socialjustice, and your company, so our listeners can also have a look. But what else would you suggest? Like, what can we do to kind of educate ourselves on this very important topic?
Yeah, so I am an avid reader. And so when I tell people, like, pause and read, oftentimes I get the, oh God, why do I have to read something else? And it's like, well, because reading is actually fundamental. It is good for you. But I think one thing that can actually happen quite easily for folks is to engage in book clubs. I think there is something very empowering to actually choosing books wisely and intentionally, having a set form of questions and protocols that you follow, and making sure that there is someone who is part of this book club who can help to poke holes in other people's thinking. Because if you have a book club where everyone is sort of practicing in the exact same way, and no one is really up to actually poking someone just a little bit to say, hey, does that require a little bit more disruption from you? Or, hey, does that actually require you to think about that a bit more and unpack it? And what is that rooted in? If that person's not in the book club, then book clubs tend to fall apart, right? Because they don't actually produce the change that they could actually be producing. Mm-hmm. So I would say engaging in book clubs. And so one book that I like to recommend to people is called The Racial Healing Handbook by Annalise Singh. And so while that book is primarily focused in on the ways in which race and racism impacts the world, she does include in there how those things are also similar to the experiences of sexuality, how they're also experiences to this, the experiences of socioeconomic status, right? Like, she is very intentional about drawing out the intersections, but the book is loaded with journal prompts, right, that sort of force you to look at yourself. And so then you would bring those journal prompts and your responses into your book club meeting, right, so that people are actually getting authentic responses from each other and having the opportunity to hear about your lived experiences. So that's one thing that I think people can do. Another thing that I think is worth exploring and considering is asking people to hold you accountable. So having an accountability buddy and having a friend who can check you regularly, right? Who can say to you after your yoga class, hey, can I give you some feedback, right? And you being open to that feedback. Part of like wanting to change up what happens in our yoga communities, or even happening in our K-12 school systems, or happening in higher education, is having someone who is on your side, right? Like that's your friend, like that's your homie. They're on your side, and they can check you and tell you, like, look, you did this thing. Here's how you might go about fixing it in the future, right? And being open to it and grateful and saying thank you. Like, I don't want to keep doing that shitty thing. Thank you for letting me know. I'll not just keep it in mind, I'll do better and actively put in new processes and strategies in my workspace or in my environment. So that's that. Another thing that I think is important, and I like social media enough that I'm on it. I don't always enjoy it for the lack of rhetoric or narrative that can exist with foundation, if that makes sense, right? So you can get lots of folks who will present something, and things get presented in a way that feels incredibly emotional and stripped of the actual foundational literature theory basis for how we understand isms, right? For instance, any of the isms, or even how we understand specific actions or specific situations that have happened in our society globally, and how those things impact other people. So I think when you can find resources, and I like to think my Instagram page is fabulous for this, but I think if you can find resources and find social media pages and platforms that actually allow for you to do some of this work in a meaningful way, or to think about these things more meaningfully, that is a way to move. So I really enjoy The Conscious Kid. I think Anti-Racist Daily is really good. There's one on let me see. There's one on disability that I'm trying to think of. Disability Reframed, I think, is also a really good. These are all on Instagram. And then if you're looking for something that's going to push you to think about self-inquiry, Yoga for Social Justice, yoga number 4. Social justice is great. And again, and then you just using your contemplative practices, right? Like if you're a yoga instructor or you're a yoga student, or you're just starting to think about yoga in your life and you're listening to this podcast, using contemplative practices and applying those contemplative practices to social justice and related events and activities, or exploring social injustice, will help you a great deal. A great deal.
Thank you so much for sharing this. I hope that everyone who has listened today has been, a bit more engaged and trying to make a difference, trying to make an individual and collective, as we mentioned, collective engagement. And thank you so much, Dr. Valin, for joining us today. Thank you so much for educator us as well. I think is very important, and is very necessary, that role that you have. We are going to leave, obviously, your website and Instagram handle in the description below, on the podcast, but also on YouTube as well. And yeah, we just wanted to thank you so much for your time. It's been a great conversation. And yeah, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I appreciate it so much. And I'm sorry that my internet connection was not as great, and you're just looking at this, photo of me and not, me talking at this very moment. But I do appreciate both of you reaching out to ask me to be part of your podcast. And I look forward to listening back to it, and listening and maybe connecting with some folks who are listening right now on some other things.
Thank you so much.